Thank you. Love to serve.
Well, hey, I feel like when Ron says, when Bob says, sir, I gotta go.
People say, you don't get a
Yeah, exactly. Good evening, everyone. So good to see everybody. Because he lives, God sent his son. They called him Jesus. He came to love, heal, and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. But greater still, the calm assurance this child can face uncertain days because he lives, because he lives. I can face tomorrow because he lives. All fear is gone because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. And then one day I'll cross the river, I'll fight life's fight, no war with pain, and then as death give way to victory, I'll see the light of glory, and I know he lives, because he lives. I can face tomorrow because he lives. All fear is gone because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. A new creature. Buried with Christ, my blessed Redeemer, dead to the old life of folly and sin. Satan may call the world and treat me. There is no voice that answered within. Dead unto sin, alive through the Spirit, risen with him from the gloom of the grave. All things are new. In his great power, his power to save, dead to the world, to voices that call me, living anew, obedient but free, dead to the joys that once did enthrall me, yet is not I, Christ liveth in me. Sin hath no more his cruel dominion, walking in newness of life I am free. Glorious life of Christ our Redeemer, which he so richly shared with me. Dead to the world, to voices that call me, living anew, obedient but free. Dead to the joys that once did enthrall me, yet is not I, Christ liveth in me.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. And if you're joining us live or later online, thank you. I appreciate you watching, and I know there are many of you who are watching from home. I hope, as I've said many times, I hope that this class strengthens your faith and honors your time. Because your time is valuable, and so is your faith. So we have arrived at Daniel chapter 12, the final chapter in this book. And most of you who are here have been with me through the entire 26 weeks, and I commend you for working through this with me. There's a lot of material to cover, and we've gone over a lot. All of this is preserved on YouTube, on the church's website, so you can go and watch all of that. So, the vision from Daniel 11 dealt with nations who, throughout a span of over 300 years, 370 plus years, ran over Israel. They're caught between Egypt and Syria, and there's the promised land that's just repeatedly trampled by invaders. The Israelites suffered the horrors of war. They suffered the violations of their dignity. And Daniel understands all this through the vision that he's given. So here we are up to chapter 12, and the chapter break, like the chapter break of chapter 11, falls at a bad place. Chapter 11 should end at verse 3, really, of chapter 12. So this is a continuation of the same speaker, of the divine individual who's speaking and telling him of all of these atrocities that we've gone over for the last 3 weeks in chapter 11. And here's the chart that you've seen. It had to make one more appearance. Daniel is between 83 to 85 on this. It could be 85 to 89. We're not sure. He's in his mid to late 80s at this point. So, Daniel 10, starting in verse 1, it says, "And the word was true, and it was a great conflict, and he understood the word and had understanding of the vision." And Daniel 12 concludes the vision from Daniel 11. You may recall that this divine messenger said he received help from Michael. There was a messenger in chapter 10, verse 13. "The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia." And in this vision, he again will mention Michael, this time alluding to Michael's stewardship over the people of Israel. We're going to see that. Jude, verse 9, calls Michael the archangel, and here Daniel calls Michael the great prince. Starting in verse 1 of Daniel 12, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge over your people." The phrase translated, "who has charge," carries with it a sense of defending or protecting the people. And the people referenced in this verse specifically refers to the Jews. And the Jews, if you remember, they are now scattered. Some of them are in Babylon. Some of them are in Israel rebuilding. And Michael has charge over them. Michael watched over them. In this verse, that Michael shall arise, signals that Michael will stand and act. He will confront another spiritual power. And if you move forward into the book of Revelation, chapter 12, Michael and his angels defeat an ancient red dragon who is identified as Satan. And Satan, expelled from heaven, unleashes his wrath upon the earth, quote, "because he knows that his time is short." So this moves us to the idea of the Great Tribulation. The vision circles back to this, and the time of trouble that is going to be mentioned is not a new event. This is something that was already talked about a few verses before in Daniel 11, 40 through 45. Chapter 12, at the end of verse 1, "And there shall be a time of trouble such as has never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Now this phrase, a time of trouble such as never been, this gets reflected back to us in Matthew chapter 24. If you'll recall, Jesus is answering the question about when the temple will be destroyed and when will his second coming occur in chapter 24. There are several passages from chapter 24 on your handouts because we're going to hit that a few times tonight. Chapter 24 and verse 21. For there will be a great tribulation such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So Daniel has said a time of trouble such as never has been. Jesus is clearly making reference to this passage in Daniel. And again in verse 27 of Matthew 24, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So he's talking about the second coming at this point. And then in verse 29 through 31, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So when Jesus spoke these words, it's evident that he had this vision from Daniel in mind. Earlier in verse 15 of that same chapter, he mentions Daniel by name. Verse 15 of Matthew 24. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So we have this great tribulation that's going to happen, but the great tribulation is followed by a great deliverance. In verse at the end of the verse, God watches over his people. At the end of verse 1, but at the time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Now again, your people refers to the Jews. In the greater sense, it refers to God's children. Paul, when writing to the Galatians, reminded them, chapter 3 and verse 7, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. The messenger in this vision speaks of a book that contains names. What book would that be? The book of life, right? The book of life. Several other books appear in Daniel. And here are the references to these books, the books that are open at judgment. Old Testament writings. Now he was specifically reading Jeremiah, but he mentions multiple books in chapter 9, verse 2. Chapter 10, verse 21 mentions the book of truth. Now, that's not a title for a book. Most people looking at this say that that is the contents of the vision from chapter 11, calling it the book of truth. But in verse 1 here, we have an appearance of the book of life. Moses. When the Israelites worshiped the golden calf, remember what God was going to do to Israel? He was going to strike down the nation, and he said that he would raise up a new people from Moses. Remember that? And Moses is begging God not to destroy the Israelites. And he says in Exodus chapter 32, starting in verse 32, but now if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. But the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. So he had a conversation with God, and he knew about this book as far back as Exodus. Using similar language, David mentions the same book. This is a registry of the righteous. Psalm 69 and verse 28, let them be blotted out of the book of the living. Let them not be enrolled among the righteous. Revelation presents the book of life 7 times. So we move on to what's the most exciting piece to me in this chapter, this part of the chapter and the very end, because this is a resurrection promise. This is the first clear, unobscured resurrection promise that appears in the Old Testament. And interpreters call this the theological climax of Daniel. Daniel 12 and verse 2, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Literally meaning the land of dust, the dust of the earth alludes to the curse that Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19. "By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." When did this happen? God declares this curse when he drives Adam and Eve from the garden. And Solomon, in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 20, writes this, "All go to one place, all are from the dust, and to dust all return." Abraham, when he was speaking to God, felt this. Remember the conversation that Abraham had when God told him that he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And he asked him, "Well, if there's 50 righteous, will you spare the 50? Remember that? And he keeps asking God repeatedly to lower that number. And he gets him all the way down to what? Anybody remember? 10. Gets him down to 10 righteous people. And during that conversation, he says this in Genesis 18, verse 27. "Abraham answered and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes." I who am but dust and ashes. He felt this in the presence of God. There are allusions to the resurrection in other passages. Job, which may have been written prior to the book of Genesis. Job speaks of a Redeemer whom he will see when his flesh is destroyed. Job 19, verses 25 through 27. "For I know that my Redeemer lives." That's where that song title comes from. "And at the last he will stand upon the earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another." But here in Daniel, it's clear. That's more obscure. It's absolutely clear in Daniel there will be a resurrection. Daniel 12 begins with the promise of the resurrection, and it ends with the promise of the resurrection, bookending the chapter. It ends with the promise that Daniel would rest and that he would later stand, and we will get there. Stars. Let's talk about stars. Here's the passage. "And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." In Scripture, stars often relate to angels. They are also associated with the saints. The red dragon of Revelation chapter 12 and verse 4 swept a third of the stars from heaven to the earth. Conceivably, this would be he swept angels. Answering Job, God spoke of the morning stars when he asked, "Where were you?" Job 38 and verse 7. "When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy." Stars also relate to the righteous. Consider God's promise to Abraham. Genesis 15 and verse 5. "And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you're able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be." Here in Daniel, the messenger tells him that the wise shall shine like the stars forever and ever. Paul, in the letter to the Philippians, likens Christians to stars. Philippians 2, verses 14 through 16, NIV translation uses the word stars. "Do everything without grumbling or arguing, There's one of my favorite verses. That's a tough one, folks. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, right? Some translations will say without arguing or complaining. Okay. That's a command. That's not a suggestion. Verse 15, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. We're lights in the world. Matthew 5:16, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So then Daniel's given a command to seal the book. Verse 4 of chapter 12. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, for until the time of the end many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. The command to seal the book is not a command for Daniel to hide the truth. And on reading this on the surface, you could come away with that idea. This is not a command to hide the truth. In ancient times, a seal was used to preserve and validate the authenticity of a document. It guaranteed that a document was unaltered. Let's imagine today that you received an envelope that had a broken seal. Can you be sure that the contents of that envelope are genuine? That that's what the sender intended to send to you? Of course you can't. And in the same manner, the messenger commands Daniel to shut up the words and seal the book. This is so he can preserve this for future generations. So now we're going to get to telescoping prophecy. And we talked about this weeks ago. We've brought it up a few times. Prophetic telescoping describes prophecies that are realized in multiple fulfillments. They work from a lesser to a greater fulfillment that has a greater impact. The time of the end, in verse 4, refers to future judgment. Here we conclude a telescoping prophecy that works two ways. Tremper Longman writes this, and it's on I've got the slide here. This previous section telescopes earthly and cosmic realities as well as near future and far future events. Now, I'm not going to leave you hanging here without a graphic because I was able to do this. So here's the prophet, this man in blue, and the prophecy, imagine it stretches out like a telescope. That's why it's growing. There's your near and your lesser fulfillment. It happens in the closer future. Perhaps that's a distant future for that prophet. Could be hundreds of years beyond that prophet. In the case of Daniel, receiving the prophecy in Daniel's chapter 11, it was hundreds of years. And then you move on to a greater fulfillment. And that greater fulfillment, we're talking about the return of Christ, the end times. That's as far as we're going. This is prophetic telescoping. So back to this man in linen. Daniel 10, 11, and 12 present one event. Daniel was at the Tigris River. I'm going to just repaint this picture for you. A messenger appeared in response to his prayer and fasting, and Daniel's companions who were with him fled in terror. Daniel's strength fled, and he fell to the ground in a deep sleep. A hand touched him, and an angel commanded Daniel to stand. He spoke to Daniel about the book of truth, and then the 49-verse prophecy, which is the 49-verse prophecy of chapters 11 and 12. And then here we read in verse 5 of Daniel 12. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. So, like the man clothed in linen, the two new figures are unnamed. Hovering over the river, he was superior to them. Now, linen was a fabric that was worn by priests and angels who entered God's presence. In Revelation, the bride of Christ, which represents the church, and the armies of heaven wore fine linen. That's in Revelation 19. So for how long? And this was the key question. The man in linen's superiority became more evident when an angel posed this question. And someone said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the stream, "How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?" This question is like the question that was posed by a holy one in Daniel chapter 8. That's where we had the vision of the ram and the goat, and that was set in a similar environment. He saw himself at the Ulai Canal in Susa, and so you had running water in the same setting. Daniel chapter 8, verses 13 and 14, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, 'For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?' And he said to me, 'For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored.'" The answer to that question in Daniel 8 mirrors the answer that we get in Daniel chapter 12. Answers in both cases tie large numbers to days. For scholars who have studied the numbers, and trust me, they have studied these numbers in many, many ways. You could read and read about this and never come to a conclusion. The 2,300 evenings ultimately are a mystery to us. The important takeaway is this: the time that God's people will suffer has a limited duration, and God will not allow them to suffer forever. So, this angelic being asks the question, and he gets a solemn answer. How long shall it be till the end of these wonders is the question. And the man clothed in linen gives him this answer. Verse 7, "And I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time." Have we seen that before? Yes. Yes, we have. Hands are instruments that manifest the will of the mind. Instruments that manifest the will of the mind. The man in linen raised both hands. This is a doubly solemn gesture showing the surety of the words that he speaks. And his will was directed toward God. God himself used a similar gesture when he swore an oath in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 40. "For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear as I live forever." And then the Hebrew writer reminded us of the surety of God's promises in Hebrews 6:13. "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself." So time, times, and half a time. Previously in Daniel 7, we encountered this phrase. That was way back in chapter 7, weeks ago. And in that chapter, the blasphemy of the little horn was what was in view. This little horn persecuted the saints for this time period. Daniel 7, verse 25. "He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time." This phrase appears in Daniel. It appears in Revelation. The saints will be given into this oppressor's hand for a time, times, and half a time. We had this before. Time is one period. Times doubles that period. And half a time, that's a period that doesn't get concluded, it's abruptly ended. This phrase appears in John's vision, Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14. But the woman was given the two wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. Scholars typically interpret this as 3.5 years. When we were studying this back in chapter 7, you'll recall that there are individuals who say this is an undetermined amount of time. Equating the horn with the beast of Revelation, we find the beast is given a power for 42 months, which would match the 3.5-year time period in this case. Revelation 13, verses 4 through 5, and they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. Can we with certainty ascribe 3.5 years to the phrase time, times, and half a time? No. It seems likely, but we cannot with absolute certainty ascribe that. 7, if you'll recall when we talked about numbers, 7 is a divinely set complete period. What's 3.5? It's half of 7, right? There were 7 days of creation. Half of 7 is half of a divine time frame, half of a divine cycle. And this abrupt end reminds us of the warnings that Christ offers in Matthew 24 concerning the second coming. Matthew 24:36, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. Now, it was fashionable a few years ago for people to tell you they knew when Christ was going to come. Apparently, they skipped this verse. If Jesus tells you that only God knows, guess what? That's the truth there. Only God knows. Matthew 24, verse 44, therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. The time of persecution is fixed but indefinite. God permits persecution, but he will not let it go unchecked. And when Christ comes, his coming will be without warning. So, continuing in verse 7 at the end of the verse, it would be for a time, times, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things will be finished. Interpreters note that the shattering of the holy people appears in passages like at Zechariah chapters 12, 13, and 14, where Antiochus and later the Antichrist, telescoping prophecy again, brutalizes the people of God. So, what shall be the outcome? Up to this point, Daniel understood the vision. Its contents were not a mystery. Recall at Daniel's words at the beginning of chapter 10. He tells us he understood. Verse 1, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the word was revealed to Daniel, who is named Belteshazzar. And the word was true, and it was a great conflict. And he understood the word, and he had understanding of the vision. And people reading the original Hebrew text say that he had an understanding of the vision and through the vision. He understood what that vision was all about. But now we have a new question that's been asked. This celestial being has asked the man in linen a question. And this conversation prompts more questions. Daniel 12, verses 8 through 9. I heard, but I did not understand. Have we seen that before? The end of chapter 8. He didn't understand that vision. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Naturally, Daniel wants to know what is going to happen to the people of Israel. He has a deep concern for them. Why do I say that? Whenever he's praying for their help. What does he do? He fasts for 3 weeks and he prays. He has this heartfelt concern for the people of Israel. He wants to know, after all the suffering, what will be the final concrete outcome for the children of God? How does this relate to everything that he's learned about the future? And he's learned a lot about the future. And the angel responds with the words, "Go your way." What was Daniel's way? Daniel had served God all his life. His was the way of righteousness. Go your way. There's an extra layer of meaning there. Continue the way you've been. And with this, the messenger stops Daniel's questions. It was enough for him to experience this revelation. And again, we are reminded of Deuteronomy 29:29. All of you who intend to teach a Bible class or get roped into teaching a Bible class in the future, I want you to have this verse. Deuteronomy 29:29, the secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law. We have gone through almost 26 weeks of this class. I get about 40 minutes of your time every Wednesday night, and I have been using multiple commentaries, multiple resources, about 15 different ones, depending on what I'm working on. But when we started this class, do you remember what I said about the Bible? The Bible is its own best commentary. None of those documents that I'm reading, none of those books that I'm reading trump the material that's in this book. So, Moses here is telling us there are some things that are hidden. They belong to God. We don't need to know. And it's okay if you're teaching and you don't know the answer to the question. You can just say, "I don't know, I will get back to you," right? I'm dealing in these books with scholars who have years and years of experience interpreting Scripture, and they don't know the answers to some of these hard questions. So it's okay. God does not demand that we fully comprehend every mystery in the Bible. If we did, I'm lost. Right? Rather, we're asked to receive his word with humility. And I'm reminded of the book of James, chapter 1 and verse 21. "Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls." We're asked to receive this word with humility. Pure and wise. We're about to look at verse 10. Fire is the oldest method of purifying precious metals. Gold became a symbol of immortality because gold does not corrode. The refinement processes will separate gold from the impurities that are in the gold. Daniel 12 and verse 10, "Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. But the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand." So here the righteous are likened to refined metal. The pure will understand. You see that word "understand" appear twice at the end of that verse. The pure will understand, and the wicked will not. Spiritual truths and the signs of the times will completely elude the wicked. So we get a final enigma. The angel presents two puzzling numbers in the next two verses. Verses 11 and 12, "And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days." Scholars offer multiple ways to interpret these numbers with additional calculations, additional ways of interpreting months. Understand that the ancients did not collectively use the same calendar. And you think about in America alone, reckoning of time did not become a universally organized thing until we had trains. And they had to coordinate those trains that were stopping in different towns. We don't have precise calculations that we can point to that are conclusive. Some of the proposals have more merit than others, but none are conclusive. And with the additional calculations, the interpreters will relate the weeks of Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27 to the days that appear here in chapter 12. Tanner provides a 12-page summary analysis, 12 pages. And he goes through a variety of theories regarding this. Sprinkle styles these two verses as, quote, a cryptic riddle. And he's got a great book, by the way, on Daniel. Longman concludes that God alone knows, and that seems to be the point. God alone knows, and that seems to be the point. And that's okay, right? Again, Deuteronomy 29:29, as believers, we understand that God is sovereign and God's going to take care of us, so it's okay. So the messenger leaves Daniel with a final encouragement, and it's almost like an epitaph for Daniel. This is a final promise that's reserved specifically for Daniel and targeted to Daniel. Verse 13, but go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. You shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Daniel was faithful all his life. And his best course of action was to continue unto the end. Matthew chapter 24 again, verse 13. Christ says, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The words rest and sleep often signify death in Scripture. Death is not the end of one's existence, but it is a release from the struggles of life. Here, the angel applied the promise of everlasting life from verse 2. There's a promise of everlasting life. He applies that specifically to the prophet Daniel. The prophet would rest in death. Then he would stand in his allotted place. Daniel would rise to receive his allotted reward and inheritance. So, next week, we're going to review the entire book of Daniel. Bring something to write with. I may have some fill-in-the-blanks or word banks on your handout. It's not a test. This is to help you remember what we have covered. Additionally, I have got folders up here that have all of the class handouts that we've had for the last 2 quarters. I've got a little more than 40 of these folders. There's not enough for everybody in this room. We have quite a lot of people here. If you can get one per household, that would be great. If you don't get one and you would like a folder, because I know there's not enough for everybody, let me know and we can make more. Thank you so much. Next week, we will review Daniel. The folders are right here.